Jake Morrison stood in the middle of the huge auction hall on Nexus Station and felt his stomach twist into knots. The air around him buzzed with alien voices speaking in languages that hurt his ears and made clicking sounds that no human throat could make. Purple lights from the ceiling cast strange shadows. On the floor were hundreds of different creatures sat waiting for the auction to begin. He gripped the small credit chip in his pocket so hard that his knuckles turned white. Inside that tiny piece of metal was 50,000 credits, and that was all the money that Earth had left. 50,000 credits to buy the terraforming machines that could save his dying planet. 50,000 credits to compete against alien merchants who had millions. The smell of different alien bodies filled the air and made Jake want to cover his nose. Some smelled like rotting flowers, while others reminded him of burning plastic. He tried to breathe through his mouth, but that only made him taste the strange air recycling system that kept this floating space station alive. Ambassador. Lisa Carter stood next to him and her face was pale with worry. She kept checking her datapad and shaking her head. Every few minutes she would look at Jake and open her mouth like she wanted to say something, but then close it again. They both knew what the numbers meant. They both knew they were here to watch Earth lose its last chance. The terraforming equipment sat on display at the front of the hall. 3 massive machines that could turn a dead planet into a garden world in just 20 years. Each machine was the size of a small building and covered in silver metal that seemed to glow with its own light. Tubes and wires connected them to each other in ways that Jake could not understand. These machines represented technology that humanity had tried to build for 50 years and failed every time. Earth was dying. The atmosphere was so poisoned that people could only live in sealed cities now. The oceans were black with pollution and nothing grew in the soil anymore. Scientists said they had maybe 10 years before the last city dome failed and humanity went extinct. These 3 machines could fix everything, but they cost more money than Earth had ever seen. Across the hall sat Vextar, the Zalonian merchant prince, and Jake hated him more than he had ever hated anyone in his life. The alien was 3 meters tall with purple skin that looked wet and slimy. 8 thick tentacles grew from his back and moved constantly like angry snakes. His eyes were huge and black, and when he looked at Jake, those eyes seemed to laugh at human weakness. Vexitar lounged on a floating chair that hovered 2 meters above the ground. Golden rings covered his tentacles, and his translator collar was made from some kind of rare blue metal that probably cost more than most planets made in a year. He was here for fun. He was here to watch lesser species fight over scraps while he decided who lived and who died. The Xylonians had controlled terraforming technology for 800 years. They sold it to species they liked and refused to sell it to species they wanted to see disappear. Humans were definitely on the disappear list. Vextar had made that clear in every message he sent to Earth's government. He thought humans were too young and too stupid to deserve advanced technology. Other aliens filled the rest of the hall, but Jake barely saw them. His eyes kept moving between the terraforming machines and Vextar's smug face. The Zalonian merchant prince had bid on terraforming equipment 47 times in the past 10 years. He won the auction every single time and then stored the machines in his private warehouses where they collected dust. He did not need them. He bought them to make sure other species could not have them. The auctioneer was a Korthak with 4 arms and skin like tree bark. It climbed onto a platform at the front of the hall and began speaking in the common galactic language. Its voice was translated into hundreds of different languages by speakers built into every seat. Jake heard the words in English, but they sounded flat and emotionless. Welcome to Auction Block 7 on Nexus Station. Today we sell 3 Mark V terraforming units manufactured by Zelton Industries. These units are capable of atmospheric conversion for Class M planets with standard gravity and magnetic fields. Bidding starts at 100,000 credits. Jake's heart sank. 100,000 credits was already twice what Earth could afford. He looked around the hall and saw dozens of aliens checking their credit displays. Some were representatives of rich worlds that wanted backup terraforming equipment. Others were merchants like Vextar who collected advanced technology like humans collected old coins. 100,000 credits, called out a voice from the back of the hall. Jake turned and saw a lizard-like creature with gold scales, raising one of its 4 hands. 150,000, said another alien that looked like a walking tree, the sea. Bids came fast and Jake felt each one like a punch to his stomach. 200,000, 300,000, 500,000. Within 10 minutes, the price had climbed to 800,000 credits and most of the smaller bidders had given up. Only the serious players remained now. Jake counted 6 aliens still bidding, including Vexitar, who had not even bothered to speak yet. The Zilonian merchant prince watched the bidding with those huge black eyes, and his tentacles swayed back and forth like he was listening to music. Ambassador Carter grabbed Jake's arm and squeezed tight. "Jake, we have to try something. We cannot just stand here and watch." Jake nodded but kept his eyes on Vexitar. He had studied everything about the Zilonian merchant prince for 6 months. He knew that Vexitar had never lost an auction. He knew that Vexitar enjoyed crushing the dreams of younger species. Most importantly, he knew that Vexitar's biggest weakness was his pride. The bidding reached 1 million credits, and 3 more aliens dropped out. Now only Vexitar and 2 others remained in the fight, a blue-skinned Andorian merchant who ran shipping companies across 12 systems, a crystalline being from the Outer Rim who spoke only in mathematical equations that the translators could barely handle. 1.2 million credits, said the Andorian. Merchant, and sweat dripped from his blue forehead. 1.5 million, responded, the crystal being in a voice that sounded like breaking glass. Finally, Vexitar spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and smooth and reminded Jake of oil poured over velvet. 2 million credits. Both remaining bidders looked at him and then looked at their credit displays. The Andorian merchant shook his blue head and sat back in his chair. The crystal being flickered once and then went dim. They were done. Vexitar's tentacles writhed with pleasure. His black eyes found Jake across the hall and seemed to wink. The auctioneer raised his first hand to start the final countdown. 2 million credits going once. Jake stepped forward. Jake Morrison walked toward the center of the auction hall, and every alien eye in the room turned to look at him. The sound of his boots on the metal floor echoed through the sudden silence. He could feel hundreds of different creatures studying him, like he was some strange animal that had wandered into their space. Humans were still new to most of the galaxy. Earth had only joined Galactic Society 15 years ago, and most aliens still thought of humans as primitive creatures who barely knew how to build spaceships. They were not entirely wrong. Human technology was centuries behind most galactic civilizations, and human culture was considered crude and violent by galactic standards, but Jake knew something that most aliens did not understand about humans. When humans had nothing left to lose, they became the most dangerous creatures in the universe. They would try things that no sane species would ever consider. They would take risks that defied all logic and reason. 2.1 million credits, Jake called out in a voice that carried across the entire hall. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the station's air recycling system humming in the walls. Ambassador Carter gasped behind him and grabbed his shoulder with shaking fingers. She knew as well as he did that Earth's entire emergency fund contained only 50,000 credits. Vexitar's huge black eyes focused on Jake with the intensity of targeting lasers. For the first time since the auction began, the Zilonian merchant prince looked genuinely surprised. His 8 tentacles had stopped their constant swaying and now hung motionless behind his floating chair. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. "We have a bid of 2.1 million credits from the human representative." "Do I hear 2.2 million? Vexitar leaned forward in his chair and studied Jake's face. The Zilonian had dealt with thousands of different species over his long life, and he prided himself on reading the intentions of other creatures. But human faces were still a mystery to him. Their expressions meant different things than the facial movements of other species. "Human," Vexitar said, and his voice rumbled through the hall like distant thunder. "You interest me. Your species is known to have very limited resources. Perhaps you would like to explain how Earth acquired over 2 million credits for this purchase." Jake smiled, and that simple expression sent a chill through the watching crowd. It was not the smile of someone who was nervous or afraid. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and enjoyed every second of it. "Maybe we found some new resources," Jake replied in a casual tone that made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Maybe we made some new friends. Maybe we discovered something valuable that we decided to trade. The galaxy is full of surprises, don't you think?" Vexitar's tentacles began moving again, but now they moved in sharp, angry patterns instead of the smooth swaying from before. The Zilonian merchant prince was not used to being challenged by anyone, let alone a representative of a species he considered barely civilized. 2.5 million credits, Vextar announced, and his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. Jake nodded like he had expected this exact bid. 3 million credits. Now the crowd began to murmur and whisper in dozens of different languages. 3 million credits was more than the terraforming equipment was actually worth. It was enough money to buy a small moon or fund a colony ship to another galaxy. Several aliens began recording the auction with devices that Jake could not identify. Ambassador Carter pulled on Jake's sleeve and hissed in his ear. "Jake, what are you doing?" "We don't have 3 million credits. We don't have 300 credits. If you win this bid, Earth will be charged with auction fraud, and they will ban us from every trading station in this sector." Jake turned slightly so he could whisper back without the crowd hearing. "Lisa, trust me. I know what I'm doing. Vextar has never been challenged like this before, and his pride will not let him back down. He would rather bankrupt himself than lose face in front of all these aliens." "But what if he calls our bluff?" Lisa whispered back with panic in her voice. "Then Earth dies either way," Jake said quietly. "At least this way we go down fighting." Vextar rose from his floating chair, and his full 3-meter height cast a shadow over the front rows of seats. His purple skin had darkened to an almost black color, which Jake knew from his research meant the Zilonian was feeling strong emotions. His 8 tentacles spread wide behind him like the hood of an angry cobra. "You test my patience, human," Vexitar said, and now his voice carried a warning that made the air temperature seem to drop several degrees. "Your species has been in space for barely 20 years. You have no established trade routes, no advanced technology, and no wealthy allies. Yet you claim to have millions of credits for equipment you could never operate even if you owned it." Jake shrugged, and the gesture looked so casual that it made Vextar's tentacles writhe with anger. "You seem to know a lot about what humans can and cannot do, but maybe you don't know as much as you think you do." The crowd was getting restless now. Aliens were standing up in their seats to get a better view. Some were making calls to their home worlds to report what was happening. Others were calculating the odds and placing bets on how high the bidding would go before one side gave up. 3.5 million credits, Vextar declared, and his voice echoed off the metal walls. Jake pretended to think about this for a moment. He tapped his chin with one finger like he was doing complex mathematics in his head. Then he smiled again, and that smile was even wider than before. 4 million credits, he said, and his voice was still as calm as if he was ordering breakfast. Now several aliens in the crowd gasped out loud. 4 million credits was an insane amount of money for terraforming equipment. It was enough to build an entire space station or fund a war between small planets. The auctioneer was sweating despite the climate control system and kept wiping his forehead with all 4 of his hands. Vextar stared at Jake for a full minute without speaking. The Zilonian's huge black eyes seemed to be searching for any sign of weakness or deception in the human's face. His tentacles had coiled into tight spirals behind his back, which meant he was thinking hard about his next move. In that minute of silence, Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His mouth was dry and his hands were starting to shake, but he kept his expression calm and confident. Everything depended on Vextar believing that Earth actually had the money. To back up these incredible bids, Ambassador Carter had gone, completely pale, and was gripping the back of Jake's shirt so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She kept opening her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She looked like someone watching a friend walk off the edge of a cliff. Finally, Vextar spoke again, and his voice was quieter than before, but somehow more dangerous. "You play a very risky game, human. I hope for your sake that you know how it ends." 5 million credits, Vextar said, and the entire hall erupted in chaos. The auction hall exploded into noise and confusion as aliens jumped from their seats and began shouting in languages that Jake had never heard before. Some creatures were running toward the exits while others pushed forward to get a better view of the human who had dared to challenge the great Vextar. The auctioneer was banging his gavel with all 4 hands, but nobody was paying attention to him anymore. Jake stood in the center of this chaos and felt strangely calm. Everything around him seemed to be moving in slow motion, like he was watching a movie instead of living through the most important moment in human history. He could see Ambassador Carter's mouth moving as she tried to shout something at him, but he could not hear her words over the noise. Vextar had not moved from his position beside his floating chair. The Zilonian merchant prince stood like a purple statue with his 8 tentacles spread wide and his huge black eyes locked onto Jake's face. 5 million credits was more money than Vextar had ever bid on anything before. It was more than some entire star systems were worth. But Jake could see something in those alien eyes that gave him hope. For the first time since the auction began, Vextar looked uncertain. The Zilonian was starting to wonder if maybe he had underestimated humanity. Maybe these primitive creatures from Earth had resources that he did not know about. Jake raised his hand, and somehow that simple gesture cut through all the noise in the hall. Aliens stopped shouting and turned to look at him. Even the air recycling system seemed to quiet down, as if the entire station was holding its breath. 10 million credits, Jake said in a voice that was barely louder than normal conversation, but somehow carried to every corner of the massive hall. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake wondered if time itself had stopped. He could see alien faces frozen in expressions of shock and disbelief. Some had their mouths hanging open while others had their eyes bulging out of their heads. A few were pointing at him like he was some kind of impossible creature that should not exist. Ambassador, Carter made a choking sound and grabbed Jake's arm so hard that her fingernails dug into his skin through his shirt. Her face had gone from pale to completely white, and she looked like she might faint at any moment. She kept shaking her head and mouthing the word no over and over again. The auctioneer had dropped his gavel and was staring at Jake like the human had just announced that he was going to eat the space station. All four of the aliens' hands were trembling, and sweat was dripping from his bark-like skin onto the platform where he stood. But it was Vextar's reaction that Jake focused on. The Zilonian merchant prince had taken a step backward, and his tentacles were no longer spread wide in a display of dominance. Instead, they were coiled tightly against his back in what Jake recognized as a defensive posture. For the first time in his long life, Vextar was facing an opponent who seemed willing to match any bid he could make. 10 million credits, Vextar repeated slowly like he was testing how the words sounded. That is a very large sum of money, human. Larger than most planets see in a decade. Are you certain that your species possesses such wealth? Jake smiled, and this time his smile was different. It was not the confident grin he had been wearing before. This smile had edges to it. It was the smile of someone who was enjoying a private joke that nobody else understood. I'm certain that you're starting to worry about whether you can afford to find out, Jake replied, and his words hit Vextar like physical blows. The crowd began murmuring again, but now the murmurs had a different quality. Instead of shock and confusion, Jake could hear something that sounded almost like respect. These aliens were starting to realize that they were watching something unprecedented. A young species was standing up to one of the most powerful merchants in the galaxy and refusing to back down. Several aliens in the crowd were making frantic calls to their governments and news agencies. Others were recording everything with devices that Jake could not identify. Word of this auction was already spreading across the galactic communication networks, and within hours every civilized world would know that a human had challenged Vextar to a bidding war. Vextar began pacing back and forth in front of his floating chair, and his tentacles writhed with agitation. 10 million credits would seriously damage his financial empire. It would force him to sell property and investments that had been in his family for generations. But losing to a human would damage something even more valuable than money. It would destroy his reputation. In Zilonian culture, reputation was everything. A merchant who was publicly humiliated could never recover from the shame. Other species would stop taking his calls, and business partners would refuse to work with him. Vextar had spent 800 years building his reputation as the most successful trader in this sector of the galaxy. 12 million credits, Vextar announced, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Jake nodded like he had been expecting this exact bid. He even looked a little bored, as if 12 million credits was pocket change to him. The performance was so convincing that several aliens in the crowd began whispering about secret human colonies that might have discovered valuable resources. 15 million credits, Jake said without hesitation. Now even the aliens who had been trying to remain calm began losing their composure. 15 million credits was enough money to terraform an entire solar system. It was enough to fund a space fleet or build a dozen cities. Several creatures actually fainted and had to be carried out of the hall by station security. Ambassador, Carter was no longer trying to stop Jake. She had let go of his arm and was now standing with her mouth hanging open and her eyes wide with amazement. She looked like someone who was watching her friend perform magic tricks that defied the laws of physics. Vextar stopped pacing and turned to stare at Jake with an intensity that made the air between them seem to shimmer. His purple skin had darkened to almost black, and his tentacles were moving in patterns that Jake had never seen before. The Zilonian was experiencing emotions that his species had no names for. "Human," Vextar said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone in the hall could hear every word. "You are either the bravest creature I have ever met or the most foolish. I cannot decide which." Jake shrugged again, and that casual gesture made Vexitar's tentacles coil into even tighter spirals. "Maybe I'm both. Maybe that's what makes humans dangerous." The word dangerous seemed to hang in the air like a threat. For the first time in the auction, Jake had openly acknowledged that this was about more than just buying terraforming equipment. This was about power and respect and the right to exist as equals in a galaxy that still saw humans as primitive newcomers. Vextar closed his huge black eyes and was silent for almost a full minute. Everyone in the hall waited to see what the Zilonian merchant prince would do. When he finally opened his eyes again, they were filled with something that looked almost like fear. 20 million credits. Vextar whispered, and the words seemed to cause him physical pain. Jake smiled his dangerous smile and raised his hand again. The entire hall held its breath as they waited to hear what impossible sum the human would name next. 50 million credits, Jake said, and his voice was still as calm as if he was discussing the weather. 50 million credits. The number hung in the air like a physical presence that pressed down on everyone in the auction hall. Jake could see aliens stumbling toward the exits as if the weight of that impossible sum was too much for them to bear. Others remained frozen in their seats with their eyes locked on the human, who had just shattered every record in galactic auction history. Vextar's tentacles went completely rigid, and his huge black eyes widened until they seemed to take up half his face. The Zilonian merchant prince opened his mouth and then closed it again without making a sound. For several seconds, he looked like a creature that had forgotten how to breathe. Jake watched Vextar's reaction with satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for. The Zilonian was no longer thinking like a calculating businessman. His pride and reputation were under attack, and that made him vulnerable to the kind of emotional mistakes that humans specialized in exploiting. Ambassador Carter had given up trying to understand what Jake was doing. She stood beside him with her hands pressed to her mouth and tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked like someone watching a beautiful building collapse in an earthquake. There was nothing she could do to stop it, but she could not look away either. The auctioneer had stopped even pretending to maintain control over the proceedings. He sat down hard on his platform and stared at Jake like the human had just announced that he was the secret emperor of the galaxy. His 4 hands were shaking so badly that he could not hold his gavel anymore. But it was the reaction of the crowd that told Jake his plan was working. The aliens were not just shocked by the size of his bid. They were beginning to believe that maybe Earth really did have 50 million credits. Maybe humanity had been hiding their true wealth and power all along. Whispers spread through the hall in dozens of different languages. Jake caught fragments of conversation that had been translated into English by the universal communicators built into every seat. Secret human colonies. Hidden asteroid mining operations. Alliance with the Forbidden Zones. Ancient technology discoveries. Every wild theory made Vextar look more uncertain. The Zilonian merchant prince had built his reputation on knowing everything about every species in this sector of the galaxy. If humans had resources that he did not know about, then maybe he had underestimated them in other ways as well. Vextar began pacing again, but now his movements were jerky and uncontrolled. His tentacles writhed behind him like angry snakes, and his purple skin kept shifting between different shades as his emotions changed from second to second. Jake had never seen a Zilonian show so much emotional instability in public. "This is impossible," Vextar muttered, and his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your species cannot possess such resources. Your planet is dying. Your technology is primitive. Your economy is based on trading raw materials for basic supplies." Jake tilted his head to one side like he was considering this argument. "That's what we wanted you to think," he said in a tone that suggested he was revealing classified information. "Did you really believe that a species capable of faster-than-light travel would be as helpless as we pretended to be?" The lie was so smooth and convincing that Jake almost believed it himself. He could see aliens in the crowd nodding their heads as if his words made perfect sense. Of course humans would hide their true capabilities. Of course they would pretend to be weak while secretly building up their strength. Vextar stopped pacing and spun around to face Jake directly. His huge black eyes were wide with something that might have been panic. "You are bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No species would risk 50 million credits on terraforming equipment." Jake smiled, and this time his smile was gentle and almost pitying. "You're absolutely right, Vextar. No species would risk 50 million credits on terraforming equipment. But maybe we're not just buying the equipment. Maybe we're buying something much more valuable." "What could be more valuable than terraforming technology?" Vextar demanded. Jake's smile grew wider and colder. "Respect." That single word hit the auction hall like an explosion. Aliens gasped and whispered and pointed at Jake with expressions of understanding and fear. They finally realized what they were witnessing. This was not just an auction. This was humanity announcing to the galaxy that they would not be ignored or dismissed or treated like children anymore. Vextar's tentacles coiled into defensive spirals as the implications of Jake's words sank in. If humanity was willing to spend 50 million credits just to prove a point, then what else might they be willing to do? What other surprises might they have hidden in their primitive-looking ships and colonies? 60 million credits, Vextar said, and his voice was barely audible. Jake nodded like he had been expecting this bid. He looked around the auction hall and seemed to notice for the first time how many aliens were recording everything. His next words would be transmitted to every corner of the galaxy within hours. "You know, Vextar," Jake said in a conversational tone that carried clearly through the silent hall, "I've been studying you for months. I know about every auction you've won and every species you've crushed. I know about the colony ships you've bankrupted and the terraforming projects you've sabotaged. I know exactly what kind of creature you are." Vextar's skin darkened to pure black and his tentacles spread wide in a threat display. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner? I am Vextar of the Third Spiral. My family has controlled trade in this sector for 8 centuries. Jake shrugged, like 8 centuries of galactic domination was not particularly impressive. "And now you're about to lose everything to a species you thought was too stupid to matter. How does that make you feel?" The question was delivered in such a casual tone that it took several seconds for the insult to register. When it did, Vextar let out a sound that Jake had never heard before. It was part roar and part whistle and part electronic screech. Several aliens in the crowd covered their ears and others actually fled the hall. 100 million credits, Jake announced before Vextar could make another bid. The number was so large that it seemed to break something fundamental in the auction hall's atmosphere. The lights flickered and the air recycling system made grinding noises like it was struggling to process what it had just heard. Several aliens collapsed in their seats and had to be revived with medical equipment that appeared from hidden panels in the walls. Ambassador Carter finally found her voice again. "Jake," she whispered, and her voice was filled with wonder and terror. "Jake, what have you done?" Jake turned to look at her and his expression was completely calm. "I've saved humanity, Lisa, or I've doomed us all. Either way, we'll go down fighting instead of begging." Vextar was no longer moving. The Zilonian merchant prince stood like a purple statue in front of his floating chair, with his tentacles hanging limp behind him, and his huge black eyes staring at nothing. 100 million credits would destroy his family's business empire and leave him destitute. But backing down now would destroy his reputation and make him a laughingstock across the galaxy. The auctioneer managed to find his voice long enough to ask the required question. "We have a bid of 100 million credits." "Do I hear 101 million? Every eye in the hall turned to look at Vextar. The Zilonian's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. His tentacles twitched like they were trying to form words, but his brain seemed to have shut down completely. Jake waited patiently for Vextar's response. Inside his pocket, his fingers touched the small credit chip that contained Earth's last 50,000 credits. Everything now depended on whether the Zilonian merchant prince's pride was stronger than his business sense. The silence in the auction hall stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the sound of Ambassador Carter's quick, shallow breathing beside him. Somewhere in the crowd, an alien was making quiet, clicking sounds that might have been nervous laughter or perhaps a prayer in a language that human translators could not process. Vextar remained frozen beside his floating chair like a purple statue that had been carved from stone. His 8 tentacles hung motionless behind him, and his huge black eyes stared at Jake without blinking. The Zilonian merchant prince looked like a creature that had been struck by lightning, and was still trying to understand what had happened to him. Jake knew that everything now depended on Vexitar's next decision. If the Xylonian called his bluff and demanded proof of payment, then Jake would be arrested for auction fraud, and Earth would be banned from every trading station in the galaxy. But if Vexitar's pride forced him to make another bid, then he would bankrupt himself trying to match an amount that humanity could never actually pay. The crowd was getting restless again. Aliens were whispering to each other and checking their communication devices to see if the news networks had picked up the story yet. Several creatures were making quiet bets on what would happen next. The tension in the air was so thick that it seemed to press down on everyone like a physical weight. Ambassador Carter grabbed Jake's sleeve and pulled him close enough to whisper in his ear. "Jake, please tell me you have a plan. Please tell me this isn't just some insane gamble that's going to get us all killed." Jake turned his head slightly so he could whisper back without the crowd hearing. "Lisa, do you remember what I told you about human psychology when we were preparing for this mission? You said that humans are unpredictable because we're willing to risk everything when we have nothing left to lose," she whispered back. "Exactly. And right now Vexitar is trying to figure out whether I'm brilliant or completely insane. The problem is that from his perspective there might not be any difference between the two." Ambassador Carter stared at him with wide eyes. "Are you saying that even you don't know if this plan will work?" Jake smiled, and his expression was both confident and terrifying. "Lisa, the best human plans are the ones that are so crazy they might actually succeed. That's what makes us dangerous." Before Ambassador Carter could respond, Vexitar finally moved. The Xylonian merchant prince raised his head and looked directly at Jake with an expression that was filled with hatred, and something that might have been respect. His tentacles began moving again, but now they moved in slow, deliberate patterns instead of the angry writhing from before. "Human," Vexitar said, and his voice was quiet but somehow more threatening than when he had been shouting. "You have forced me into a position that I have never experienced before. For 800 years, my family has dominated trade in this sector of the galaxy. We have never been challenged. We have never been threatened. We have never been made to look foolish in front of our peers." Jake nodded like he understood completely. "I know exactly what position I've put you in, Vexitar. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Vexitar's huge black eyes narrowed, and his tentacles coiled into tight spirals behind his back. "I am going to teach you why younger species should show proper respect to their elders. 150 million credits." The bid hit the auction hall like a physical explosion. Several aliens screamed and ran for the exits while others fell out of their chairs and had to be helped to their feet. The auctioneer made a choking sound and dropped his gavel again. Ambassador Carter went completely white and grabbed onto Jake's arm to keep from falling down. But Jake just smiled. It was the same calm, confident smile that he had been wearing throughout the entire auction. The smile of someone who had just won a game that nobody else even realized they were playing. "You know what, Vexitar?" Jake said in a conversational tone that carried clearly through the chaos. "I think you've made your point. 150 million credits is definitely more than I want to pay for terraforming equipment." The hall fell silent again as aliens tried to process what the human had just said. Was he backing down? Was he admitting defeat? Or was this another twist in a game that none of them understood? Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the small credit chip that contained Earth's last 50,000 credits. He held it up so that everyone in the hall could see it clearly. The tiny piece of metal looked pathetic compared to the massive sums that had been discussed over the past hour. "The truth is," Jake said, and his voice was still perfectly calm, "I only have 1 credit left." The admission sent shockwaves through the crowd. Aliens gasped and pointed and made sounds of disbelief in languages that Jake could not identify. Some looked angry at being deceived, while others looked impressed by the sheer audacity of what the human had attempted. Vexitar's tentacles went rigid again, and his mouth fell open. "1 credit?" he repeated like he was testing how the words sounded. "You bid 100 million credits when you only had 1 credit?" Jake nodded and his smile grew wider. "Actually, I was willing to bid everything, including my honor, my reputation, and my species' future on the belief that you wouldn't call my bluff. Because that's what humans do, Vexitar. When everything is on the line, we bet everything." The explanation hit Vexitar like a series of hammer blows. He staggered backward and had to grab onto his floating chair to keep from falling. For the first time in his long life, the Xylonian merchant prince understood that he had been completely outmaneuvered not by superior resources or advanced technology, but by pure, audacious human psychology. "You never intended to pay," Vextar whispered, and his voice was filled with amazement and horror. This entire auction was a performance designed to trap me into destroying myself. Jake shrugged, like psychological warfare was the most natural thing in the world. I studied everything about you, Vextar. I knew that your pride would never let you back down from a challenge. I knew that you would rather bankrupt yourself than lose face in front of all these witnesses. I was counting on you being exactly the kind of creature that you are. The auctioneer finally found his voice again. Sir, we have a winning bid of 150 million credits from Vextar of the Third Spiral. However, the previous bidder has admitted to fraud, so we must— Now, wait, called out a new voice from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see a tall, blue-skinned alien in an expensive suit walking toward the auction platform. Jake recognized him as Ambassador Kelrin from the Andorian Trade Confederation. Behind him came representatives from a dozen other worlds, all looking directly at Jake with expressions of interest and respect. Ambassador Kelrin stopped in front of Jake and spoke in perfect English. Human representative, we have been watching this auction with great interest. Your species has demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and innovation that the galactic community needs. The Andorian Trade Confederation would be honored to loan Earth the funds necessary to complete this purchase. Other alien representatives nodded their agreement and began making similar offers. Within minutes, Jake found himself surrounded by creatures who wanted to do business with humanity. The species that had been ignored and dismissed for 15 years was suddenly the most popular potential partner in the hall. Vextar watched this transformation with growing horror. His attempt to humiliate humanity had backfired completely. Instead of being destroyed by their own audacity, the humans had earned the respect and admiration of dozens of other species. They had turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. Jake looked around at all the aliens offering to help Earth and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the station's climate control system. Humanity had gambled everything on a single desperate bluff, and somehow they had won more than they had ever dared to hope for. Earth remembers its friends, Jake announced to the crowd, and we never forget our enemies. Today you learned that humans don't just survive. We thrive by turning our greatest weaknesses into our greatest strengths. The applause that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever heard before.